in a sense, that's putting what happens in the future based on what we haven't done here. My view is, if someone enters into a relationship, God, or becomes awakened to that, what they're awakened to is the reality that God has already forgiven them. They're already born from above, that they're entering into the work of the cross, which is finished, and they're enjoying that whilst they're operating in that relationship. Should they choose to walk independently of God again, there is no grace to restore them other than the grace that's already restored them. So there's nothing. That's what it talks about in Hebrews, about, well, there's no other way. There's no other way. They've already received the way. They may then have consequences of what's happening to them on earth. If they choose to live a life and go back into drug, well, they could end up dying from doing that. And therefore they're almost saying, well, I don't need God's protection. I'm doing this myself. And they're going back to following the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which has consequences. And those consequences aren't God punishing them. They are the result of the choices they make on earth. When they get into that, let's say they do die physically, and they have been awakened, even though they might have chosen to forget that or accept it, then it says God will wipe away their tears. So there's a sense where they enter in. They don't have to go through the fire of, they will face the judgment seat, because that judgment seat is fire, but it's not the fire that people don't know God. It's the fire for those who do know God. And we, of course, can enter that judgment seat now and don't have to go through that later date, in a way, because our scroll can be purified and there can be gold, silver, precious stones, and all the wood, hay, and straw can be removed. Now, they might have very few gold, silver, and precious stones on their scroll, because they might have not really fulfilled most of what God has called them to do from this earthly perspective. And they might have a load of straw and wood, hay, and rubbish and all that stuff. So that will get purified by the fire of God's eyes, and the regret and loss will be wiped away, and all the tears are wiped away. So there's no hindrance to them entering into an ongoing fulfillment of their destiny, which outworks in the realms of heaven, because he wipes away their tears by putting them through that process. But it's not the same as those who never entered into a relationship with Jesus, who go to the fire of a different place. It's still the fire of God's love, and it's just how that gets outworked differently, I think. So they don't go back to a lost state, because in a sense, the lost state is only the state of their mind at the time. From God's perspective, no one's lost, are they? They're still his. He's not lost them. They've lost who they are. He's not lost them. They're still his. They're still his children. He still loves them. He's not lost them, but they've lost touch with him. So that then gets dealt with. So I don't think they have to go through the same process as someone who's never entered into a relationship with God and would have no idea of what their scroll was. They would have had some idea. They may have chosen for various reasons. I mean, some people go through that because of trauma. Some people through religious abuse, and they reject church, and some get sucked into it through mystic people who take them back into drugs to go and get into supernatural experiences. So there's all sorts of stuff out there. But I wouldn't say, people say, well, can you lose your salvation? Well, you never sort of gained your salvation through works. So you can't lose something that never was accomplished by works. Jesus said, no one can snatch you out of the Father's hand. I've seen people coming into that realm and going to various places. I remember having an encounter with a group of us, and we were watching people come into the realm of heaven and where they went. And it was like, oh, there's several places people are going here. Where are they going? Why are they going there? So that was just my experience. Now, in one sense, it's a moot point, because anyone who did go into that place and already had an awakened sense and they'd chosen a different way are going to choose to come back pretty quick. Because they already have an awakened conscience. They may have seared it. But I generally think that what Jesus does with those people, because they have chosen, and even though you can say, well, they went back on their choice, I think they would go through the fire of a different process. But to be honest, it doesn't really matter in the long run, because they're all going to enter and be restored to a relationship with God one way or another. Just depends on which way and how long they want to resist that choice. For me, love wins, love overcomes. But some of the question, I think, comes from, backsliding in those days was losing your salvation, and therefore there was no way out. Well, I never believed that you could lose, no matter what you did, even those days. I never believed in, losing your salvation, because I think I came from a Calvinistic perspective. Well, God chose you, but Calvinism obviously is a limited choice, only chooses some, whereas now I believe God chooses everybody. so I'm still probably more aligned to, well, it's more about God than it is about us, and what happens to us is more about God, and therefore God's goodness, kindness, patience, tolerance, faithfulness, than our faithfulness. So I always place it, well, what's God's character like, and what would God do in this situation? And that's what would probably shape my understanding of it, because God is tolerant, he's patient. There was some, therefore, religious system that you had to go through to get back again, repentance probably, and making amends in some way to God. And you would usually feel, oh God, how many times did I bargain with God? It's like, well, I'll go to all the prayer meetings then, or I'll do this for you, and I'll do that for you, because I didn't have an assurance of this, this sort of a security of, it's all about what God has done, what Jesus has done. It's not about what I've done. It's all based in a wrong understanding of who God is, and then those doctrines develop around a more of an old covenant view of what the sort of the Hebrew people thought God, because they rejected the relationship. They rejected the marriage, set up the mediatorial system, because they were afraid of God. Effectively, when God was in the fire and the smoke on the mountains, oh no, we're not going up there. Moses, you go. 70 elders, you can go, but actually no, we're quite happy down here, thanks. And we'll make our own golden calf to worship God the way we want. It's like, so that was the system that they chose. And of course, in that system, they didn't know God. In reality, they didn't really know him. He tried to get them to know him, and there were probably some who did, who lingered in his presence, like Joshua and Caleb, who lingered in his presence and got to know him and found an intimacy in knowing him. But even they didn't have the Spirit in them, which is the change from the old covenant to the new. Sometimes the Spirit came upon them, prophets, priests, kings, they had the Spirit upon them, and sometimes artisans had the Spirit upon them to help them with their artistic work. When they made the tabernacle and all those things, the Spirit came upon them for certain things. But it's very different from in the new covenant. Everyone's alive in Christ, and the Spirit's in everybody. They just don't know it and haven't entered into a relationship with the Spirit in that way. So yeah, I think that comes really from just not really knowing God. Of course, Jesus came as the express image of the Father and said, well, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. You don't need to look anywhere else. I've come to tell you the truth, and I've come to reveal the truth. And actually, you've heard it said about God, but it isn't true. Effectively, I'm telling you now, and I'm showing you in reality what is the truth. You can see it by looking at my life, because I represent the Father's life, and I only do what I see the Father doing. It was fully, and you don't see Jesus killing anybody, murdering anyone. Yes, he was in some senses direct to some of them and spoke the truth to some of them in love to try and shake them out of their false belief systems. And he wasn't very happy of those who were leading the others astray into a pit. And he did drive people out of the money changers' tables. But, any anger he demonstrated was still an expression of love, because he wanted them to come into the knowledge of the truth. You know, even when it said, after all of the woes, woe unto you, it was still, he wanted to gather them like a chick would gather its hens under its hens, the chicks under the wing. You know, so even then, every warning he gave was not so that they would fail to heed the warning and die, that they would embrace the warning and live in abundant life. The enemy came to rob, kill, and destroy, not Jesus. You know, in fact, Jesus did not come to judge the world, it said, but to save it. You know, and I think sometimes we've sort of got things a little bit mixed up with, you know, how they describe God from their undifferentiated, non-intimate perspective of God. And that's really, unfortunately, what a lot of what we've based our new covenant teaching on is old covenant teaching, which is why Hebrews 6, which is really, Hebrews is a whole book about understanding the differences between the covenants, says, do not lay again a foundation of repentance from dead works, faith in God. I taught them as foundations myself. I understand. Without realizing it says, move on from the elementary teachings about Jesus, about the Christ or Messiah, from the perspective of, you know, move on from that. You don't need to understand that anymore, because now he's in you. You don't need the externals of laying hands on an animal to transfer your sin, or any of those understanding of what eternal judgment or, you know, resurrection would have been from that old covenant perspective. Because some of them did believe in resurrection. Obviously, Sadducees and Pharisees had a bit of a disagreement over the literal or spiritual mention of resurrection or what it meant. But, you know, in Daniel, it talks about resurrection, but it talks about it in the same language as it talks about the end of the old and the destruction of the old and the temple system. You know, so it's really referring to the fact that we're all alive in Christ rather than some physical resurrection at the end of the world. Because it's all mentioned in the same thing that Jesus put together in the same passage as well. Of, here's what's going to happen when this old covenant ends. Make sure you escape. Don't stay in that system and die physically, you know, because you can escape and receive life, you know, and be saved. You know, we tend to so spiritualize salvation that we miss some of the context is actual physical salvation from harm and from death, you know, because it's all become so just spiritual. Well, you'll go to heaven one day, you know, and actually there's so much more meaning to it, even in terms of sozo and the meaning of health and wholeness and the fullness of what we receive in our inheritance in Christ. But also, I think people neglect sometimes the word had a total meaning of physically being saved, you know, from harm or drowning or other things in the context of what it was originally spoken, you know. So yeah, a lot of this all comes down to, do we really know God in intimacy, heart to heart, face to face? Therefore, some of those things I think will come out of that knowing his heart and knowing his unconditional love, and knowing that actually forgiveness is not based on performance of any work. It's based on what Jesus has already done. Love keeps no record of wrongs. You know, religion keeps record of all sorts of wrongs and tries to change people in the way of some, again, more performance, you know, in whichever way you get changed. And obviously different streams have different versions of getting changed. Some would be obviously pure Catholic stream of, well, say 3 Hail Marys and do a few of this and this and that and the other, and you're absolved. Well, because that's all part of it, isn't it? You know, all part of the system. I mean, I know very little about any of it because I wasn't really in any of that system. So I had no Catholic pillars holding up the framework of my thinking in my mind. I did have Protestant pillars, you know, or a Protestant pillar and an Augustinian one and an evangelical one and a sola scriptura one. And, you know, I didn't realize how influenced I was by a mindset that had old covenant thinking and Greek thinking. You know, I had Greek thinking and Hebrew thinking from an old covenant perspective, framing my reality, even though I'd never learned Greek or Hebrew. But it wasn't. It's the cultural programming that my religious upbringing had, which was quite legalistic and old covenant, you know, as well as the Greek mindset, which wasn't just in the religious thinking, it was also in the world. Our Western world is mostly based on Greek philosophy, you know, and the Western world that I was brought up in would be very different from an Eastern world that some other people would be brought up in. So they wouldn't have that pillar in their mind, perhaps. They would have a different pillar holding up their thinking from an Eastern perspective. And maybe they'd have a mystical pillar, but that wouldn't necessarily make it good, you know, from an Eastern meditative philosophy, you know, which is very much, you know, focused on emptying the mind rather than fixing the mind on something good, which would be God. You know, I was also extremely saddened by, you could call one of the fathers of the mystical movement, who published a video on Facebook, on YouTube, which basically said that there was a group of people he was in relationship with where he was completely withdrawing from relationship from them on the basis of their doctrine and belief. And it's not something that I'm unaware of, because obviously I've been subject to that myself from the same group as is Justin, over the basis of the restoration of all things and a few other things. But this was over something which didn't seem to me worthy of doing that. Not that ever we should be separating relationship on the basis of beliefs, because we're all one in Christ, regardless of what we believe. And I was very, very saddened by the public statement and all the comments that people made on it that were so, oh yeah. The issue was over alien human spirits, of teaching that there were, or I would call them lingering human souls, that they could affect people and needed releasing and helping to pass on, or, you know, helping people not to be afflicted by that, whether they be familial or whatever. And in this video, that was what the doctrine was, that he was separating from a group over. Now, for me, he then went into a whole spiel on, you know, birthing demons from within, actually, which is like, okay, I'm sure that's not particularly orthodox teaching either, that a lot of people would argue with you over, if you're saying, well, I can birth demons, but I can't restore them, you know, in a sense. But you know, that to me is a Kabbalah teaching, and I'm not really interested in that. But it was a sad issue of, I am telling you publicly that I'm withdrawing from a group over this doctrine, and we're no longer in relationship. And of course, that group has done that a number of times with other people. For me, that is just hugely, hugely sad, and is so contradictory to the love of God and forgiveness and relationship, and I just feel, I almost cried when I saw it. I was so upset that this was publicly said. I know it goes on in private, but to publicly come, and therefore to make it okay for other people to do the same, over what? Because now the precedent is set that in the mystic movement, you can separate over people if they don't agree with you. And this was the issue. They don't agree with me. And if you don't agree with me, you can't be part of this group. That to me is denominational and divisive. And I was so saddened over it. And I'm not going to mention the person's name, but people will have seen it probably and will probably know who it is. But you know, almost brought me to tears when I saw it, you know, because I was interested. I saw this video come up on Facebook and it was like, oh, what's this about? Looked at it and immediately it was like, you know, no, I'm withdrawing relationship because of this doctrine and this, that, and the other. And it was just like, oh, sad, you know. And actually it's pretty irrelevant anyway, whether someone's being afflicted by a familiar spirit or they're being afflicted by a spirit of someone who, or a soul of someone who's not yet passed on. Irrelevant. The issue is, how can we help someone to be free? Not what was the source that bondage was. Freedom is the issue. Let's focus on freeing people from whatever the source might be. And to be honest, does it really matter what the source is if actually the issue is freedom for somebody? You know, Arthur Burke, who originally I think was the one I first saw talk about alien human spirits in his terminology. And then I met a guy in the UK and a couple in the UK who were also doing the same sort of ministry. And they, I think, referred to it as, you know, lingering human spirits. And I prefer lingering human souls, because I don't think people's spirits linger here. I think they go back to the Father. But I do think people's souls can linger here. And we should help them to pass over and preach the gospel to them so they pass over in a restored state rather than in an unrestored state in their own thinking. But that's their choice. You know, I'm not there to punish them or to annihilate them, you know. And actually, even with, you know, familiar spirits, my focus is not on the spirit or the demon or whatever you want to call it. It's on the freedom of the person. And we spent too much time delivering people and not enough time helping people stay free by helping them know their identity, where they wouldn't need to be afflicted by things that would deceive them in their own thinking. If you know who you are, you don't get deceived, you know. And you know, I'm not against setting people free, that's for sure. It says in Ecclesiastes that the spirit goes back to the Father, but the spirit and soul, if not connected in a sense of entering into that relationship that Jesus has already accomplished, then the soul has not entered through Jesus. But the spirit was always come from God. The spirit came into the body to form the soul, if you like. The soul formed after the spirit entered into the cells, and the soul formed. But the spirit already existed and just goes back to where it was before. The spirit, for me, I don't believe in an unredeemed spirit. I believe the spirit has always been from God, just was not connected to our identity, and therefore was competing, because it talks about the tension between the soul and spirit, and the sort of almost the conflict between soul and spirit, where the spirit looks to bring us into the relationship with our identity and God, and the soul's resistant in operating in humanism and tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So there, you know, even when someone first identifies that they're alive to God, it doesn't automatically mean their soul gives up, does it? Having control over their lives. So I do believe Ecclesiastes talks about the spirit going back to the Father, and that's been my experience of seeing it. And then the soul goes on to the fire of God's presence for refining and purification. Now, if it gets stuck here, it's because of trauma. I think trauma traps potentially souls to an event or a place. And that could be to a family event, and therefore it can therefore be attached to family lines as a familial spirit, which can attach itself to certain families. So I've sort of, when someone dies and they have a familial spirit, where does that familial spirit go? Well, it just becomes someone who attaches itself to another part of the family. And some people's deliverance is from familial spirits, which are demons, which were in a family member that then afflicted another family member because of some family right to do it. So I do accept that some deliverance is that. Probably most of it might be that, but that doesn't mean all of it can be that. And Arthur Burke, who operates empirically with evidence, said very clearly that you probably weren't going to find this in the Bible, and it probably isn't a biblical thing. Well, neither is 99% of the things we do every day in the Bible. But it doesn't mean we dismiss it as being true. It's like computers are true, they're not in the Bible. It's like, so why would we think everything is in the Bible? It isn't. So the fact that there may be, well, Jesus did talk about demons or unclean spirits, which I would say an unclean spirit is actually a lingering human soul. He described it in those terms. And because unclean was someone who wasn't in the covenant. You know, unclean wasn't just like a sinner in one sense. Obviously, sin was part of it, but it was an excommunication, or like being outside of the covenant was really, because Gentiles were unclean. You know, that was the view. You know, Gentiles were, whatever they called them, goyim or whatever, were unclean. They were unclean people. They weren't people. So unclean as a term may just refer to that. So Jesus may have referred to different classes of spirit souls, demons, whatever they are. Because I don't believe demons are spirits. I mean, they are spiritual identities, but they're a soul. They're the souls that were on earth, and they wander around earth looking to afflict somebody or outwork their personality. And I believe they are those who were not human, who died in the flood, who were some way Nephilim spirited people or mixture, didn't have a human spirit, and therefore had a soul. And I think they were manufactured in Hebrew, you know, talks about it in Genesis 6, through angels mixing some sort of genetic DNA thing to create hybrids. Well, if they didn't have a human spirit, then, and they died in the flood, then they remained on earth, roaming the earth, looking for a soul to possess. Well, there weren't too many souls to possess after the flood. There was only 8. so there weren't too many. And they certainly seemed to attach themselves to one group of that family line straight away, which were Ham. Mm-hmm. And they then seem to have because I think genetically, they may well have had stuff passed to them, which was an attraction, let's say, to those demons. Well, let's call them that, if you want to call them that, who then created nations of those that were totally anti-God and were idol worshippers and all of that. And some of them happened to be giants. So some of them seem to be purely Nephilim, which is genetically possible. You know, if you look at Noah as being pure in his generations, which I believe is genetic purity, it doesn't talk about Noah's wife, who was obviously human, but may have had some Cain seed, may have had some Nephilim seed within her DNA, and therefore Noah's children may have had a mixture or may have been pure. And I believe the line of sort of that comes from Seth all the way to Noah, right through obviously to Jesus, I think is pure, because I think Shem had pure human DNA, because that's possible when you have let's say a quarter DNA or half a DNA, and then you mix with you get full DNA. So it's all, I mean, I don't go into genetics, but you know enough about hybridization and F1 hybrids and all that sort of stuff to know that you can have recessive and dominant genes and all that stuff within genetics, human genetics. And I believe that Shem, Ham, and Japheth had different mixtures of genetic material, and that Ham attracted, and eventually his wife may also have had a mixture of that, and may have had a lot of that, and then he produced Nephilim children, which were giants who had 6 toes and 6 fingers and all sorts of stuff, you know, because it says that those Nephilim were there after the flood as well as before the flood in Hebrews. Well, I don't believe there was another incursion of watcher angels, because they got chained up. So there was a genetic propagation of that, and the seed of Cain, serpent seed, also was there mixed in, because Jesus called some of them, you know, of your father the devil. You know, so they must have had some serpent seed. How much of it, I don't know, but he certainly called some of them that. And it does say that the enemy planted sons of his kingdom in the world, which I think is the seed of Cain. My view was that everything that Jesus could created would be restored, and that includes all fallen angels that he created by him, through him, for him. In Colossians, it talks about that. So for me, I have no doubt that any being that Jesus created for a purpose, for relationship, will be restored, including Lucifer. But it's a choice, but I do believe eventually you'll make that choice. But I don't know how long that will take, but I do believe all that he created will be restored. But he didn't create Nephilim.
Right.
Angels and man did in collusion. So what the Father, and I thought, to me, it would be, well, maybe they'll just cease to exist or be annihilated or whatever, because God didn't create them. They didn't have a human spirit. Therefore, they don't have the spirit soul coming together in relationship. But as I then matured in sort of relationship with Father, and he could talk to me about some stuff which originally he wasn't talking to me about, because I did ask him the question, he just didn't give me an answer. Eventually he did talk to me and said, well, when it came about, actually, when he first engaged me about creating something, not an inanimate thing, but in creating a guardian for portals out in the solar system which didn't have enough guardians. And I sort of said to him, can I do that? And he said, well, you choose to create other things. Why do you think, made in my image, you wouldn't be able to create a being for a purpose? Like I've created beings for purposes. So I thought, oh, okay. And I was asked by guardians to do this, and I went and checked it out with the Father, and he said, well, yeah, of course you can do it. I said, well, why do I need to do it? And I was a bit, so like, surely you created enough of them. did they, a load of them fall then? He said, no, none of them fell. But we left a lot for man to complete as they matured in our image. So there's stuff left for us to do. And that is one of it. And so I was all in this at the time. And so I was thinking about the responsibility of that which I created. Am I responsible for that guardian? What am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to look after it? What am I supposed to, I mean, I was like, it's a little bit like, this is a bit, which probably, why you didn't talk to me about it earlier, because I would have probably even more freaked out, but so I think, so it's like, you created it because you were asked to create it for a purpose, and the other guardians will make sure that it's cared for. That, oh, praise God, I don't have to look after them. Right, a bit beyond my sort of desire, really, at least, if not capacity. But then the Father then talked about sort of, as we mature, we will also make decisions based on judgment, because it talks about us judging angels. Now, obviously, people think about that judgment in the negative sense, but I believe it's a positive sense. So I would judge fallen angels as restorable, and I judge those non-fallen angels for what they've done, and they've blessed me. So I thank them, and I'm appreciative of the things they've done in my life and around my life. So I honor them for what they've done to bless me. So that's a form of judgment. So I think people just get this so negative thing about judgment. It's always punishment or whatever. No, it's about blessing. I think Pamela first sort of put me onto that thing, I think, actually, when she shared she did that. And I thought, oh yeah, why, that's a really good way of thinking about it. So I actually chose to do that, and found they were very receptive to it in the right way. So the Father was talking to me about judging angels and about creating, and he said, when you mature to a position of like fatherhood rather than just sonship, then you can choose to do that, to judge what you've created. And immediately I'm like, is he talking about demons? So I asked him the question, are you talking about demons? And he said, yes. So man will choose what happens to them. But I believe restored man, mature man, and mature sonship. So what will I choose? I would choose to do exactly what Jesus did to me, and to the fallen angels, to choose to restore them. And I believe that obviously God wants us to behave like he has to his creation, to anything we might have created in the past or might create in the future. And so for me, I now believe that there is a possibility that they can be restored. To what is the question? And I still don't know the answer to that, but maybe to something we assign them to, because they don't have a purpose in God, do they? Because God never created them in the first place with a destiny. So we may need to assign destiny to them so they can be, restoration is probably a wrong word, because restoration is something that already exists to something already exists. Whereas maybe this is something that we will choose, that they can continue with a purpose, which will be a good purpose. and that they would obviously have to choose to come through forgiveness of Jesus for what they have done so far and receive that, because they ain't going to get away scot-free, are they? They're going to have to come and acknowledge that they need Jesus, you know. So maybe we will offer them that, perhaps. Now, I know people really struggle with this stuff, and I know, you know, these sort of things cause a lot of people to struggle because they're conditioned by the whole, oh, they're all going to be sent into the lake of fire. Well, what's the lake of fire? The love of God. So, you know, which was made for the devil and his angels. Yes. Well, actually, that wasn't talking about the devil or angels. It was talking about the religious leaders and their followers or workers, you know, in context. That's what Revelation was in context, was the whole end of the old covenant system. So it wasn't talk, you know, because the word for devil, diabolos, or for Satan, satanos, accuser, and for angels, angelos, can be applied to humans as well as spirit beings. And it's a Greek word, you know, angelos, the messenger, isn't it? So, well, they're human messengers as well as angelic ones. So it doesn't, you know, we must just not assume that what we've got in English is actually the correct translation or meaning of the original. And I don't think it is. But even if it was, that fire is still for purification and refining, and not for destruction or punishment or torment. It does open up all sorts of, okay, where is our thinking coming on? And are we willing to forgive everyone who's afflicted us, including the demons, as Jesus actually asked the Father to do, because he'd obviously already done it publicly before anyone had ever asked for it or ever done anything in any way. He was being crucified at the time, which was actually before he went into death, which was linking back to what he had done in representing man before the foundation of the world, which is why he could ask for forgiveness, because it was based on God's love for his creation and Jesus' identification with his creation as the lamb who identified with the sheep. You know, Jesus was not a sheep. He was a shepherd, wasn't he? But he took on the role of a sheep. You could say he was also expressed as a lion who took on the role of a sheep, of a lamb, because he identified with us in our brokenness to fully bring about our restoration. Well, that was done before the foundation of the world. So Jesus asked the Father to forgive them even before he went into death. Death dealt with the wages of our lost identity, which that was death. Punishment was never the wages of lost identity. The wages of sin is death. All died in Adam. All lost identity and died in Adam. In Christ, all were made alive because he overcame death. Jesus came to take away the sin of the world, not to punish it. So the renewing of the mind is an ongoing process, but it may come a point where we have ascended to a state of maturity where there is nothing left to renew. We're in total agreement, but that doesn't mean that we know everything. There may still, therefore, be encounters and knowledge and wisdom and understanding of things which go beyond that, because I believe Adam was sinless in that he knew his identity and had never done anything outside of that identity, outside of the spirit that filtered. He perceived life and reality through spirit, not soul, primarily first. So before his memory received anything that was stored, or knowledge or understanding, it came through the spirit, because he was clothed in spirit. His spirit clothed his soul and body. Therefore, he wasn't primarily functioning in the physical realm first, but the spiritual, and therefore everything was interpreted the right way, and therefore was only interpreted through his relationship with the Father. That was how Adam was, and therefore, when he chose to operate independently by following Eve, so that she could be restored or redeemed, then he lost his identity. I don't think he knew, he didn't deliberately want to, but he wanted Eve to be saved, if you like. and therefore he knew that she wouldn't be saved on her own. So he chose to sacrifice himself, because he was the first type of Christ, if you like. So he sacrificed himself on behalf of Eve, like Jesus did for the whole sense of mankind, as an offering. So he offered himself in a way. Now, of course, he's responsible, because it doesn't say man died in Eve, did it? It says man died in all were dead in Adam. So he became the figurehead of that choice. But he then hid away because he lost the covering of his spirit. He never knew the world from any other way other than relationship with the Father. So therefore, if Adam had not done that, he would have matured. He would have increased or ascended in maturity by engaging the firestones and the reflection of the 9 stages of man that would eventually become 12, which we see from the 9 firestones and the 12 stones on the high priest breastplate, which was a man and God together in union and oneness. So included in this created order, that man and God would be ruling together in oneness, which is sort of the intention. Now, that would have been through a whole load of processes. Now, I've engaged the firestones in my own journey that's brought me into a maturing state of each encounter takes me sort of higher, if you like, or deeper into God, or whatever way to put it. But there are many stages of that. Now, restoration, I don't believe, will take us back to where Adam was. Restoration will be taking us to where God intended Adam to be, so that will be more and more mature. Now, when we get to a stage where we would be where Adam was intended to be, then I think things will shift. Maybe shifting into a different age, because it talks about ages to come. Now, that was obviously originally referring to Old Covenant age, New Covenant age. But actually, are there other ages to come that have other levels of ascension? Because I do believe we will be transfigured to operate with our spirit primarily again, clothing our being, and therefore heaven and earth will be restored to relationship, and we will be able to reconnect in the whole of our being, living in different realms or dimensions. Because I think Adam was able to walk into Eden. See, I don't believe the tree of life was ever in Adam's garden. It was because it really represented the pathway of following life, which was God, to Jesus. Even though Jesus was not physically there, he still existed as the Son of God and as the light and way, the truth, and the life, and all of that. So the tree of life is a representative of living in Jesus, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is a representative of living in independence. It's actually not a tree, it's a path of choice. It's the choice that we made to follow our own path. And there were those of Adam's children who didn't sin according to the likeness of Adam, who followed the path through the fiery sword back through into the realms of heaven, and walked in the realms of heaven and still have a physical body, just like Enoch and Elijah and others. So I don't think we have to look at it as just the level of understanding or maturity that we now know and what that might be. I believe ultimately we will be transfigured to fully become who Adam would have become had he continued the process of maturity. And then we will go beyond. So restoration will, in a sense, come to an end when God's original purpose is restored, although there will be no end to the increase in his government of peace. So there will still be an ongoing process, I think, of us becoming more like him. So you could say, will restoration ever end? Will his increase ever end? Will peace never end? No, probably not. So, but I don't know. I don't understand or have been given revelation of what that might be like. But I do think the Father has said to me, and what he has said is, you will ascend to be ascended fathers. you will become an ascended father, which carries with it a different level than being a son. So will I create something that I become father to eventually when I'm in that state? Well, I've learned an awful lot about the whole process. I would certainly hope if I did, I wouldn't want to go through the same process that this one has gone. So I'd be like, okay, is there a caveat that it can't fall down into the mess that we've ended up in? Because I wouldn't want to create something. Well, then how do you create something that doesn't have choice? I mean, these are philosophical questions, I think, which are sort of quite wide reaching and are beyond the scope of my level of intellect at the moment, of understanding. But I'm not saying we won't get there or have a level of understanding which will enable us to understand things differently. It's like at the moment, I was reading an article earlier that the UK government has just received the first quantum computer. And the UK is in the forefront of quantum computing technology and advance and exploration in it. So they've just, guess where it went? I mean, it won't be difficult to guess where it went. Ministry of Defense, of course. Yeah, there we go. Anyway, yeah, should give it to the health service, but they didn't. But anyway, quantum computing operates on such a different level to what we're used to in computing, which is on binary zeros and ones. Quantum computing operates on superposition, existing or not existing, which is obviously quantum physics of being non-local or local. So it can do computations which are beyond the wildest imagination of any binary programming or computer. Now, that's what it could be like when our minds are transformed, or we take on an ascended consciousness or an enlightened consciousness, which goes beyond what we couldn't even imagine. I mean, even computing, go back 100 years, when they were using abacuses, or they first started to invent mechanical calculators. And they're, fascinating when you look at those old first calculators, and then you got the first calculating machines, and even the first computer, which was like, in a huge room with like massive fans because of the heat and extraction and these huge big tape things and all this stuff. And now you've got more power in my watch than they had on the whole of the Apollo mission. It's ridiculous, but that's what's going on. Well, think of our expansion of our consciousness and the abilities of our consciousness to be creative like God. We don't have any, in a sense, anything to compare it or it's so hard to think, what could it be like? Because in a sense, we're still operating on binary, or we're still operating on an abacus, let's say, when actually we'll be operating on a quantum computer, which will be able to do an infinite number of calculations every microsecond. It's like, talking to someone in the 17th century about an iPhone and hoping that we could have a conversation that they would have any understanding of what you're talking about. God could be talking to me in something that I have no way of actually being able to reference it to anything. I've had experiences like that, of going into dimensions that had no reference point in this dimension. So I just couldn't describe it. I had no way of describing it because it had no reference point to the grid that I'm used to, which was like, well, I think that probably will be where we will end up in sonship. It will be beyond the measure that even now we could even think about. But it's fun. I do think, I do, sort of have those conversations with God in a limited fashion. And I think he's communicating stuff to me that I still don't have a grid for, that I couldn't even describe and I couldn't even write down. But I think he is talking to me and he is sharing his heart with me, but at a heart to heart level rather than a conscious understanding level. So I think those things in me are part of me. And I think they are the part of me that is always looking for something beyond. But there is always going to be beyond, beyond, and a beyond, beyond, and a beyond, beyond, beyond. Because that's, I think, programmed in by my intimacy with the Father, who knows that I can contain this as a intellectual question and answer or information, but I can have it within me as something which draws me and desires that I would continue to pursue ascension and maturity. It's definitely a tree because I've eaten fruit from it and I've walked through it. It is a tree at one level, but there's more levels to what the meaning of that tree is. Would have needed to come to a point of maturity to be able to have taken it, and therefore not risked falling into a state that if you were immortal, you'd end up in a state of perpetual lost identity. So God knew where we were going, obviously, and didn't want us to be immortal and then choose to follow our own path. In a sense of, so he's don't touch this. If they hadn't have touched either and have ascended to the point where that was no longer a way they were even going to choose, then following that path and taking the path of life, which would not end physically, would have then be something that we can enter into. And I think the same applies to us today. Why would anyone want to be immortal and miserable? It's like, I do not want to live forever in a miserable state. That means in a state of any sense of entropy, of deterioration or anything else. I want the fullness of health to continue to live in, not sort of, well, I'm going to live forever and I'm going to have dementia. I mean, that'd be ridiculous, wouldn't it? Yeah. In one sense. I mean, the spirit could be still active. So, and I know people with dementia, their spirit is still very active. And so that's why they're not dead, some people. It seems to be because they're still functioning. I was, my father-in-law, who was, was a man who followed God and was a great guy, had all the religious stuff, but actually was a really loving guy. And I think was a really sort of good testimony of what a loving person was. I sensed, when he had dementia and when he was like, didn't recognize, people and all of that, I engaged his spirit and his spirit was extremely active. Even though he probably wouldn't have understood that while he was alive, even, or while he was ministering, he probably wouldn't have understood that level of spiritual activity. I engaged it and I thought, yeah, he's not finished what he's doing, in the spirit. So I look at it in those terms, and I think it's more than just what we see on the surface, I think. And therefore, God is God. So he's aware of everything, and therefore, had taken account of the path and the journey. And I don't think wanted anybody to risk in a fallen state, having to live in that fallen state without end, because that would have been horrendous. So he put into place the process. And I think for them to engage that tree, you had to be walking in the realms of heaven, because it was in the Eden, not the garden east of Eden. So the tree of life was always in Eden, not in the east of Eden. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil was east of Eden, because that was their garden, and they chose from that choice. And it's, literally, it's more about what the spiritual meaning of that choice was, rather than it being a literal tree. It may have been a tree. I can't say I've went back and looked at it, but I think it was more the opportunity to choose, and they chose. Eve chose the offer to be like God, which she already was, but through her own humanistic efforts. And that was the deception that she entered into. Adam was not deceived, it says. He wasn't deceived. He knew what he was doing. But I don't think he did it for bad reasons. I think it was a good reason he did it, but he still got the blame, Of course, he blamed Eve when as soon as and she blamed God. So it was like, well, you made that serpent, it's your fault. You shouldn't have put him there in the first place. It's just like, because immediately they lost their whole connection, and now they're defending themselves with their own understanding, which didn't take long, did it? But it was a huge shock for them to be clothed in glory, to have lost that glory, to that being separated from that glory and separated from God in the sense of how it was. God obviously engaged them and clothed them with skin, and the whole thing of blood and all that stuff sort of comes into it. I know there's lots of theories around that, them saying that blood is congealed light and all that. You'll find that if you look into heart math and other things. And I know I'm sort of like, yeah, okay, if it is, it is. If it isn't, it doesn't really bother me too much whether it's true or not. And you find all sorts of things stated, and then you go and try and find out where they came from, or who discovered that, or who's saying it. And it's quite hard to track down the source or the origin of certain things sometimes, but I go on what I resonate with. Does that resonate in my spirit as true? Yes. Well, I'm going to accept that is true, even if I can't find the source, because I accept it as true because it seems to align with the truth that I'm finding in Jesus. So I don't need the source in everything for me to think that is true. I don't need proof, because I resonate with truth. So sometimes it's interesting to find out where it came from, but not always you can find it. And you can't always find the source of everything that's been said. But is it true? Does it carry the hallmark of the frequency of truth? Yeah. Okay, well, I'm happy to accept, maybe not all of it, but some of it, because sometimes there's a mixture in what's being said. God reiterated what would happen, that through the seed of the woman, that mankind would be saved, because Jesus was the seed of the woman. Now, obviously, that also came through Adam as a line, because Abel and then Seth came through Adam. Cain didn't came through Adam. Cain was a result of the serpent implantation of DNA. So the twins, which is bifundifrication, twins from different fathers, which is a scientific possible fact because it's happened. Those twins obviously came from a different source. Now, ultimately, Jesus, I don't really believe, had Eve or Adam's DNA. I think he had an implanted egg put into Eve, but obviously the symbol of it was, there. Now, therefore, what Adam did was to choose that Eve wouldn't die alone, or die in that state. And I think inherently he knew something of the Father's heart. So then when God meets them and talks to them and tells them of what will happen, he talks about Eve, Jesus coming to crush the Satan's head and all of that stuff. So he's prophesying of Jesus actually coming in the way he did. So I think that's what Adam was doing. No, he didn't redeem Eve from the point of saved her in any way like Jesus could do it, but without the seed of the woman, then there would have been no ongoing line. Now, she could have, there were children that existed at that point, so it could have been, but I think his choice was, I know that this is a deception, but I am not leaving my wife. That's and I have had conversation around it, although trying to get a straight answer out of one of the cloud of witnesses sometimes is not always easy, because it's almost like they don't have permission to tell you everything. So Adam did talk to me about his children and all the thousands of children they had before they entered that state, and those who then chose to go back through the path to the tree of life, and those who didn't, and some chose God as father and some chose Adam as father. Those were the ones that Cain was able to go and find, who had cities out there, because there were a lot of them and they'd already expanded. So they weren't not fruitful. They weren't, disobedient, if you like, from the beginning, because time didn't exist in the same framework. time fell. Well, it's a difficult concept, but time was not the same before as after. And so there was a lot of people who were children of Adam and Eve. And there was no fallen sense, so they were able to reproduce without there being this genetic issue over brothers and sisters. That's a concept which came through law, and there seems to be times through history where different things seem to apply. Abraham wasn't ever told off for having different wives. God didn't seem to have a problem with Jacob having two sisters as wives. I think Jacob had a problem with it. I think because he was deceived into it by Laban, tricked into it. But that actually may have been what he reaped from he sowed what he reaped. Reaped what he sowed. Because he deceived into receiving having him lay hands on him and bless him. So there was a bit of a bit of karma there, I guess. You got back a little bit in being deceived. But there are certain things that didn't seem to be an issue, and then there are things which we have applied. So it's interesting. I was asking this question the other day of what is marriage? Is it the piece of paper and the legal thing that we have, or is it something from God's perspective very different? No, I'm not against marriage. I'm not against a legal piece of paper, but actually we know a legal piece of paper doesn't stop people doing things contradictory to what they vowed in marriage, does it? So in a sense, what is marriage from God's perspective, and how does he view it? And the New Testament doesn't say an awful lot other than the marriage bed should be faithful, and I think that's absolutely correct, but really doesn't go into whatever ceremony or words or anything else. Obviously there was an old covenant perspective to marriage, and they did have a process, went through the sort of betrothal process to the consummation process and all of that, but they also had a concept of girls could be married at 13 or something and basically sold off, almost traded for a position or territory or a favor. And it was like, I certainly wouldn't think that. We'd call it human trafficking and child abuse today, and that was acceptable in those days. And I don't think that would be something I would want to see as an acceptable state of what marriage is. So you've got to take it out of the context and put it into today's context. And I think find out, well, what is God's view today about lots of things we may have assumptions about, because we may be programmed by culture or by some religious programming into seeing things a way which maybe God doesn't view, and maybe having a fresh understanding of how God wants us to relate to what he's doing today, rather than try and apply 2,000 or 4,000 year old principles when he wants us. No, it's never going to be opposite to love. And I think that's always the measure of whether anything is true or carries truth. Is it aligned to love? And if you measure it against love, I don't think you can go too far wrong, because God is always going to look at the heart and love first before any external issues. But it does throw up a lot of questions which I think we should be potentially asking. How do we live, and how do we establish the kingdom on earth as it is in heaven today? What is the way you want us to do that? And I think certainly not the way most of the religious stuff is done, from my perspective anyway. If you enjoy these videos, would you please take a moment to like, comment and subscribe? It really does help. Thank you very much.